let's start with Israel and Gaza. Obviously, this war is horrific. It is ongoing. The U.S. is heavily involved in multiple ways. One of the things you did that brought a lot of attention before October 7th is you decided to compile and then publish this sort of mini documentary of the history of the state of Israel and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. What is it that motivated you to do that, and what is it that you think people needed to know about this history that you thought it would be worthwhile?
Yeah, sure. So I've always been a book nerd and a history nerd, and I happened to come across that topic maybe about a decade ago, where I started really digging into it past the television news and sort of magazine article level. And I guess it was the shock that I had when I started looking into the topic and realizing that the picture I had of it, which was the typical picture most sort of Americans who know the topic at a surface level have, how far removed from reality that picture that I had was. And as I learned more and more about it, and got to know people on both sides of that conflict, I found that it's one of those topics that the more somebody learns about it, regardless of which side they're on, if they're on a side and they learn more about the topic, they will become more understanding and empathetic of the other side. It's just one of those topics where that's always true. And I think it's really easy to forget that you were touching on this quite a bit when you were talking about Ukraine. It's easy to forget in America what it's like to go through a tremendous amount of suffering and what that can do to a people. If you think back to Germany after World War I, if you think about the Russians now, people wonder how they can support Putin so strongly. Just go to Russia in the 1990s and find out what that place was like, and Putin was the guy in charge when that turned around. That's going to generate a lot of loyalty. Well, if you go back to the U.S. Civil War, that was the last time we really had a war that affected Americans on a large scale. I mean, one out of every 18 or 20 men in America was a casualty in that war. Down south, 1 out of every 5 military-age males was a casualty in that war. And everybody, after that war was over, really had this idea that was terrible. That was a bad idea. Even if it ended slavery, that was just a traumatic experience for our country. And there was a real push and a real feeling on both sides of the North-South divide that we needed to try to heal those wounds and move past that, because everybody had experienced the pain that came with that war. That was a century and a half ago at this point. And it was really the last time we had that kind of experience. And so now, when we look at a lot of these wars, I think we forgot what it's like to not just have your sons go off and die. That's awful. But to have your kids die in a war, to your small children die in a war, your wife die in a war. We just don't remember what that's like as Americans. And so we end up cheering it on as if it's a spectator sport. And, in Palestine, I think there's always been a disconnect between, people find it very easy to humanize the Israelis. They meet Israelis, they're more or less like Americans, with some differences, and they can relate to them very easily. Palestinians, they think that, there's a very Orientalist view of the Palestinians as somehow much more foreign. Obviously, 9/11 didn't help with that, with our perception of the Muslim world. But when you get to know the people there, when you spend time in the West Bank, the emails I get from people who listened to the podcast series and actually came away with more sympathy for what the Jews were going through in Europe when they were driven to adopt Zionism as an ideology in the first place. These are just regular people. These are just regular people, and they have the same feelings, same emotions the rest of us have, right? And I think that we as Americans, when there's a conflict like the one that's going on between the Israelis and the Palestinians, we have the benefit of being able to step back, of being able to respond not emotionally to everything that's happening. And we really ought to take seriously our role as a peacemaker in situations like that. And actually, for quite a while, we did do that. I mean, say what you want about somebody like Bill Clinton, but he put a lot of work in to try to at least move the ball forward in the peace process. And we saw that as our role in the conflict. And that has really all changed since maybe the mid 2000s or so, when now, I mean, from the highest levels of power all the way down to the people on the street and on Twitter, when this conflict kicked off, this most recent round of violence kicked off, it's as if people see it as their job to egg the other side on. And you know, if the Israelis have, look, it's totally understandable after what happened on October 7th that the Israelis were going to be in a nasty mood, right? Like, you go back after 9/11, it would have been great if we could have stepped back, but that's asking a lot. You know, something like that happens, the country involved is going to want to do something about it just to get it back. And that's fine. I understand that. But we, as Israel's friend, as a country, and one that is disconnected from this, we ought to play the role of trying to talk them off that ledge. And we just have abandoned that role altogether. I mean, all over the world. And we've really sort of adopted like during the Cold War, we viewed chaos around the world as a very dangerous thing. You know, in 1973, when the Israelis and the Arab countries were fighting the Yom Kippur War, you know, the Soviet Union was supplying weapons and backing the Egyptians and the Syrians. And we kind of came nose to nose with the Soviet Union in a military sense for the first time since the Cuban Missile Crisis a decade before. And both the United States and the Soviet Union, we went to our respective sides that we had influence with, and we said, hey, enough is enough. You guys got to cut it out, because this could get really ugly. And that was kind of our attitude throughout the Cold War, because we knew in the Cold War that this could get really ugly for us if things spin out of control. Since the Cold War ended, I think there's a whole different calculus that American policymakers are making in terms of the cost benefit analysis of generating chaos in the world. You think back to in the late 90s and early 2000s, we had a U.S. Marine Special Operations Detachment based out of Istanbul that was running training operations, and we were arming and funding several of the Islamist militias in Chechnya that were continuing to cause problems for the Russians. And we did that even after, for several years after Chechnya was defeated and Kadyrov was put in power, and that the war was over, and there was no chance they were going to storm back and win that war or anything. It was just keeping the pot boiling. And I remember I was talking to one of the Marines who was involved with that operation at the time, and I said, why did we keep doing it, you know, after there was no military reason to do it. They weren't going to reconquer Chechnya and take their country back. And he said what everybody he knew, talked to, and the idea that all the Marines he was working with had was that the idea was just to keep the thing going, because, you know, there's a lot of reasons, but it gave Russia something that it had to deal with. You know, it prevented them from rebuilding Chechnya, from building a pipeline they wanted to put through there to compete with one of our natural gas pipelines. It made them dedicate military and diplomatic resources to the region. So just, you know, chaos is good. Chaos is actually good. And we have seen this again and again and again in the Middle East, where we don't fear chaos anymore. We see it as an asset. If we can create problems that our rivals actually end up having to deal with. And that's a very toxic approach, obviously, to take to foreign policy.
Well, let me ask you, you know, it's so interesting. President Trump, when he was running for office the first time in 2015, prided himself more than anything on being somebody who can engender negotiations and agreements. He wrote The Art of the Deal, became kind of his signature accomplishment, that he could do deals, negotiate deals better than anybody. He looked at war as kind of a failure of the ability to negotiate, which is how a lot of people have seen it throughout the ages. I think he prided himself on the fact that he was the first president in decades not to take the U.S. into a new war. And his instinct when he first talked about Israel and Palestine, one of the very first times he talked about it when he was running, was to say, we become way too pro-Israel. And as a result, we have lost the ability to foster negotiations because nobody trusts us as an honest broker anymore. We have to be much more neutral so that we can regain the ability to get a deal done so that we don't have this instability and these dangers. Now, very quickly, he kind of got into line behind the AIPAC way of looking at things for whatever reasons. He became one of the most vehemently pro-Israel presidents in history. Netanyahu loved him, kind of gave the Israelis everything they wanted, although at the same time, the Israeli-Palestinian situation was kind of quiet when he was in office. The reality, though, is we are an extremely pro-Israel country and have been for decades. It's been a long time since an American president was willing in any public or meaningful way to confront the Israelis and say what you're doing is harmful to our national interests. That was in Bush 41 when James Baker and Brent Scowcroft and even Bush said, look, we're not going to continue to give you loan guarantees if you keep expanding settlements in the West Bank, because to do so is to jeopardize the possibility for a peace deal, which in turn harms our national security. James Baker got widely vilified as an anti-Semite. They kind of backed down. And ever since, we've been a aggressively pro-Israel country on a very bipartisan basis. We give more aid to Israel than any other country. They get more aid from us than they get it from anywhere else. We're, if a pro-Israel resolution in the Congress comes up, it passes like 421 to 6, something so lopsided that almost no other issue produces. And as a result, I think Americans are largely immersed in the pro-Israel narrative all the time. Our media is pro-Israel. I know people like to deny this who are very pro-Israel, but you just look at the facts and it's undeniably true. And so I think what a lot of people believe, Daryl, about this conflict is that, look, at the end of the day, no matter what else you want to say, you have Israel that's a democratic country and wants to live in peace with its neighbors. And then on the other hand, you have Muslims who just hate Jews and hate Israel and want to take Israel off the map. Their only goal is to kill all Jews. And therefore, there's no way to side with anyone but Israel, because Israel is the only one there trying to be humanistic and kind of noble and civilized. The rest are just these primitive, hateful people who hate Jews and want to kill them all. What is what would you say to people who believe that?
You remember when we were kids and you would have your younger brother or maybe your younger cousin or something, and you were picking on him, bullying him a little bit, and you're holding him down, and maybe you're just torturing him a little bit just to show him you're stronger or whatever it is. And he gets really, really, really angry. He's like, let me up, you better let me up right now. And he starts fighting, struggling, maybe tries to bite your wrist or something to get you to let him go. And now at this point, you got to hold on because the little guy is really angry. And you tell him, I'm going to let you up if you stop struggling. And he's like, screw you, I'm not stopping. It's a similar situation to that in a lot of ways. There's no question that, and I think everybody, even very pro-Israel people, in my experience, when they really learn the history of the pre-1948 period, they come away with a lot of sympathy for what happened to the Palestinians. I mean, you're talking about 750,000 people who got driven out of their homes at gunpoint and not allowed to return, right? And those people's grandchildren are still in the places that they fled to. And that's a raw deal. You can have sympathy for what the Zionists were trying to do because of, the pogroms they were reacting to in Europe and everything. But there's no question that, like, the Zionists may have been jumping out of a burning building by going from Europe to Palestine, but they landed on somebody on the way down on the sidewalk. And that guy got really angry because he didn't understand that there was a burning building that you were jumping out of. He just knows somebody landed on him and it hurts.
Or he didn't understand why it was that he had to give up his land because the Europeans had a Holocaust against the Jews. Like, the question was, why don't you in Europe give part of your land since you're the ones who did this? Like, how do we have to give up our land to pay for your crimes?
Yeah, I mean, especially, most people, I think, when I talk to people about this, I realize a lot of the time that the average person thinks this is an ancient conflict. Like it goes back thousands of years.
Right.
It's this ancient, it's ever since Ishmael and Isaac were born. They've just been at war. That's just not true. I've got a photograph from 1913, so the year before the First World War, and the year before business in Palestine really started to accelerate. And it's a picture from a cafe in Jerusalem, or I think it might be in Jaffa, actually. Yeah. And it's a picture of a band playing in this cafe. And it's two Muslims, a Jew and a Christian, playing in a band together. In 1913, it's not that long before the founding of Israel and everything spun out of control. Things were not, this was not a blood feud much more than 100 years ago. This is a modern political dispute that is very much the result of a modern ideology. It's not even really so much of a religious impulse as much as Zionism does draw on sort of ancient mythology to tie people to it and motivate people. This is a nationalist phenomenon. This is something that emerged out of modernity, out of Europe specifically, where nationalism was on the rise, and you had this group of people who needed a country. I mean, let's just, the lesson of the Jews in the last 1,000 years and the lesson of the Palestinians in the last 70 years or so is that everybody needs their own country. It's not good to be a minority in somebody else's country. It's better in some than it is in others, but it's nice to have somewhere to go. And the Jews needed that. And, unfortunately, they did end up landing on somebody who had nothing to do with the situation. And, the United States, we actually recognized and had some level of neutrality in the situation up till about the late 60s, early 70s. Lyndon Johnson was like the first very strongly Zionist American president. And the presidents previous had misgivings. I mean, Eisenhower made the Israelis and the French and the British skedaddle from Egypt after the Suez Crisis in '56, and they weren't happy about that. But he didn't care. He had a Cold War to fight. Ever since then, we have been, lock, stock, and barrel only for Israel. We don't care what the Palestinians' grievances are. Just like we didn't care what the Russians' grievances were in the lead up to the Ukrainian war. There was a big kerfuffle over on Twitter the other day because some people were talking about reading Osama bin Laden's letter to America about his reasons for 9/11, and just hearing for the first time kind of what his actual grievances were. And that doesn't justify what people do or anything, but we ought to, like, if there's a long running conflict, especially, we should be having conversations about, like, okay, what is it these people are so upset about that they're willing to die in large numbers? They're willing to take on a state like Israel or a state like America. They're willing to incur our wrath because of something that's really apparently bothering them. What is it? We don't do that at all. We just we put everything in the same framing that we use for World War II, where they're evil, they're irrational. You cannot possibly negotiate with these people. They don't have any legitimate grievances. They don't have anything driving them toward this conflict other than hatred for us and our way of life. And I think that most people don't actually believe that, but for some reason, maybe it has to do with the media environment or just the structure of our democratic political system. The people who do take that line wield a disproportionate amount of influence in the discourse, right? And this is something that you see drive the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, especially. People, like you said, think that the Israelis want peace, the Palestinians don't want peace. That's totally just ahistorical nonsense, okay? There are good people on both sides who have worked extremely hard for peace. The Palestinian negotiators like Saeb Erekat, a lot of people who were very dedicated to trying to figure out a negotiated solution. They worked for years on it. And so did a lot of Israelis. And there are also elements on both sides, like Hamas, like the Likud party, especially as it is under Netanyahu, who truly do not want peace. They see a future further down the road that if things keep going the way that they're going right now, that they're going to end up in a much better place than they would if they negotiated a solution. They believe that. And they want to keep the conflict going until that happens. You think about how when the Oslo Accords broke down, within a very short period of time, an extremist Jewish nationalist assassinated the Israeli prime minister who was negotiating it for what he thought, for what he was giving away. Hamas lights off a couple suicide bombs on buses in Tel Aviv. That's all it took. Years of work down the drain, because both sides now all of a sudden are retrenching. The people who said you can't trust those people, they're animals, they hate us, they got validation. And in the heat of the moment, in a situation like that, they're able to shout everybody else down. And so, the extreme and inflexible maximalist elements on both sides of a conflict like this tend to be able to drag the rest of us down to their level over time. And I think we ought to, as the outside party, we really ought to work, see that it is we've got a duty, if we're going to be involved in this, to try to move both sides toward peace rather than egging on the conflict.
Well, let me ask you about this, because, in every conflict, you always are going to have extremists who don't want to resolve the conflict, who want maximalist goals to be achieved. You're never going to get rid of those. The question is, are you going to do things that drive people into their arms, that cause them to be supported more, to have people view their way of looking at things as valid? Obviously, one of the reasons Osama bin Laden or Al-Qaeda attacked the United States is they were hoping to provoke the response they did, making people more and more hate the United States, driving them into the arms of extremists. It's not a conspiracy theory. It's something extremely talked about in mainstream Israeli circles, that Netanyahu wanted Hamas to govern Gaza. He partnered with Hamas because he didn't want a more moderate face of the Palestinian movement to be seen or to govern, because then he was fearful that might lead to a solution. And the same with Hamas. Clearly, part of why Hamas attacked is they wanted the Israelis to do exactly what they're doing, so that people in Gaza and in the West Bank start to hate Israel more and drive them into the hands of Hamas and away from the more moderate voices. So extremists always want that. They kind of have a sort of common cause, if you like. But you alluded to this earlier. I think you're exactly right. Obviously, after something like October 7th, regardless of the context, regardless of the grievances that pre-existed that attack, no country can stand by and watch their citizens, killed in the most horrific ways and not take action. Like, no government would survive that. No population would tolerate inaction after an attack like that. So Israel clearly had to do something. But it was clear from the start, at least to me, given what they were saying and what I know about the Israeli government, the current composition of it, that they weren't saying we're going to go in and kill the leaders of Hamas. They were saying this is going to be a war unlike anything you've ever seen before. It's going to be unprecedented. Naftali Bennett was writing an essay in The Economist saying our real goal is to show the world that we are so unhinged, so willing to kill in large numbers, that we're going to put fear in the hearts of our enemies for generations. And even though they'll hate us, they'll be afraid to attack us. And there's obviously speculation that part of the Israeli motive is to drive Palestinians out of Gaza, because their goal in reality is to annex Gaza, to annex more and more of the West Bank until they control the whole thing. What do you think is the real goal or goals in terms of the Israeli government and why it's unleashing this amount of violence and destruction on Gaza?
A longtime mayor of Jerusalem, Teddy Kollek, a very quotable guy, he had this famous quote. Some reporter asked him, what do you think about the Palestinian problem, or what should be done about terrorism? And he said, problem? We don't have a problem. Problems have solutions. What we have is a condition, and you manage conditions, what he said. And that's, we hear the phrase mowing the lawn today with reference. It's pretty macabre, but people use it in mainstream circles in Israel to refer to these periodic operations in Gaza. And so you ask, what is the real purpose of that? If the people ordering these assaults really don't really think that they can go in there and, they know that even if they go in and round up every single member of Hamas and execute them, that's not going to end Hamas. They know enough about this stuff. They know enough about counterinsurgency to know how this works. And Hamas is an idea. The idea of resistance to Israel and all this is an idea. And they can't stamp that out by killing even a lot of people. And so they know better than that. So you have to ask, like, what is it they're really trying to do? And I think over the course of Israeli history, they've gone through periods, sometimes long periods, where it's just absolutely undeniable that the strategy that they had in mind was simply collective punishment. And they wanted to terrorize the Palestinian population, the civilian population of Palestine, terrorize them enough that maybe they would turn on, a group like Hamas. But even failing that, like, I don't think they really believe that's going to happen. We could do something like that in Iraq, say, like when we went into Ramadi and actually put real deal counterinsurgency tactics to work in Ramadi. We got a lot of buy-in from tribal leaders who ended up helping us out, turning on Al-Qaeda because we made it worth their while, and we proved that we could defend them. But the thing is, in Ramadi and throughout Iraq, the jihadists that we were dealing with there, at least half of them, in a lot of places, 60, 70, 75, 80% of the jihadists they were not Iraqis. They were from all over the place. They were from Afghanistan and Chechnya and all over. And so it was a lot easier to get these Iraqis to turn on these foreigners who very often were terrorizing the population in extraordinary ways, extorting them, taking advantage of their daughters. And so it didn't take all that much. In Gaza, you're talking about, there's a lot of people in Gaza, don't get me wrong, who do not like Hamas. I hear from them a lot. But those are still their people. It's still a friend of a friend who, occasionally runs errands for a guy that is affiliated with Hamas. So they're part of the same social networks, and it's much more complicated to root that out. I asked somebody the other day, we've all seen Red Dawn. How long would it take? What would the Russians have had to do in the movie Red Dawn for you to turn on an American group that was resisting them? No matter how brutal and how much you disagreed with the tactics of that group, what would the Russians really have to? And the answer is there's almost nothing they could do to make that happen. And so, I think that the goal, and it sounds to our American ears, because we really don't think this way anymore. There were times in our past when we certainly did, but to our credit, like for all of the terrible things that went down in Iraq and Afghanistan, when you consider the savagery of the insurgency that we were fighting, especially in Iraq, and compare the behavior of American troops there to the behavior of American troops, say, in Vietnam, which was not that long ago, we made tremendous strides, like toward having a more disciplined force that really did go out of its way, especially after about 2004, to try to avoid civilian casualties. When we went into Ramadi in 2006 and 2007, we could have done that like we did Fallujah in 2004 and just sent the Marines in to flatten the place. But we'd kind of learned the lesson that really actually doesn't help. And in a lot of ways, it makes things worse. And so we put our guys on the line. I mean, we put our soldiers and Iraqi allied soldiers at risk to actually go into these neighborhoods and do it in a much more surgical way in a place like Ramadi. And it was very effective. I think that, the Israelis, ever since the Israelis left Gaza, or pulled their settlers and forces out of Gaza, that really marked a change in the way that Israel approached the conflict altogether. Throughout most of their history, again, with episodes of insanity, they focused on targeted assassinations. They focused a lot on intelligence, and they were very cognizant of. They treated it like a counterinsurgency. They were conscious of collateral damage. They were conscious of the impact on their reputation around the world. They had the United States telling them, like, we can't have you in the Cold War causing all these problems with the Arab countries. And so there were breaks on how they handled it. And ever since they pulled out of their people out of Gaza, they've really changed to just a full-blown military response to Palestinian terrorism. And I think when you look at what's happening in Gaza, of course, everybody's going to call you an Israel hater or anti-Semitic or all the things. Everybody gets called
Pro-Hamas,
names.
pro-terrorism, pro-Hamas.
Who want to promote war.
Right.
Yeah. But the question is not what you think of Israel in a broad sense. It's not what you think of the history in a broad sense. Any of that stuff, whether Israel has a right to exist. The question is Israel meeting the standards of the first world democratic countries and in the world for trying to avoid civilian casualties? And that's all. When I look at what they're, especially in the first several weeks of this conflict, you watch what they're doing. I don't think it's possible to make the case that they were living up to those standards. Something like when they hit the Jabalia refugee camp, and the Israeli spokesman, the IDF spokesman, was talking to Wolf Blitzer, and Wolf asked him, knowing there were civilians there, you still hit this thing? And the guy said, well, there might have been tunnels there. And my ears pricked up. I was like, might have been tunnels. And then he said, well, the terrorists that you were trying to hit there, did you kill them? And he said, we're looking into that. And it's like, you hit a refugee camp with 6 JDAMs based on the idea that there might have been tunnels there and that you might have had a guy that you were able to kill who was bad. I would want the American commander who ordered something like that in Iraq or wherever, anywhere in the world, I would want that guy put on trial. For some reason, we make exceptions for Israel that truly we would not make for our own forces. There is much more outrage over things that came out during the Iraq War than things that are really pretty overwhelmingly worse when you look at what's going on in Gaza and what's been going on for a long time. I mean, you're talking about you really have to remember, you're talking about a stateless population where half the population's women, half the population's under 18 years old. You're talking about maybe 20% of the population are men over aged 18. Maybe they think 12 to 15% of the population are men between 18 and 40. So like military age men, broadly speaking. These are people who have homemade rockets and AK-47s. And obviously they proved on October 7th that can do a lot of damage. That's extremely dangerous and is something that Israel has to take very seriously. But is that something that merits a regular military, full-blown military assault kind of response? The idea that Hamas uses human shields, I'm sure there's something to that. But that's, to me, not really the point. It's not their responsibility to look after these people. Hamas is a terrorist organization. Pretty much every country on earth, their attitude toward Hamas is if you find one of them, kill them. That's how Hamas gets treated by the global community. There's no pretension that they are a first world democratic country that ought to be treated with respect at international, events and organizations, anything like that. Israel is that. Israel wants to be considered a respectable first world country, and we should hold them to first world standards. That's really.
Let me Thanks for watching this clip from System Update, our live show that airs every Monday through Friday at 7 p.m. Eastern, exclusively on Rumble. You can catch the full nightly shows live or view the backlog of episodes for free on our Rumble page. You can also find full episodes the morning after they air across all major podcasting platforms, including Spotify and Apple. All the information you need is linked below. We hope to see you there.